Are hosted by the Institute of Muslim Mental Health, otherwise known as IMMH. We really appreciate you all for joining us, whether you're on Eastern Standard Time, Pacific Standard Time, wherever you're at. We really appreciate you for joining us. Our mission here at IMMH is to optimize emotional health and well-being through research, education, training, and a network of Muslim mental health professionals to serve the community. And one way that we do that is through these free monthly webinars. And our webinar today is titled Breaking the Silence About Domestic Violence. And inshallah, we hope to address the harmful factors of stigma, silence, and misdirection that keep cycles of domestic violence going in our Muslim community, how community members can work together to break silence, support survivors, and prevent future intimate harms in our households will also be discussed, inshallah. Our presenter today is Dr. Zain Shamoon. Dr. Zain Shamoon is a graduate professor in couple and family therapy. He is dedicated to the creation of spaces where people can tell their personal stories en route to their own wellness. He currently practices therapy online and is also the host and founder of the Narratives of Pain Storytelling Showcase. He received his PhD in Human Development and Family Studies, as well as his master's degree in Couple and Family Therapy from Michigan State University. His research focused on domestic violence in South Asian communities and how survivors' personal stories help address service needs. Inshallah, we'll start today with Dr. Zain Shamoon sharing with us a little bit. And then in the last half hour, we will open it up for question and answer. How we'll do question and answer is that you're more than welcome to send either me or Dr. Zain Shamoon the question in the chat, or to raise your hand and ask it out loud. We will be taking one question at a time, inshallah, just to make sure that we can get to as many people as possible. And as we kind of go through question and answer, and folks have any comments or feedback, let's just remember to be as respectful and understanding of others' points of view, inshallah, as we can be. So without further ado, we will begin. Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakallah Wafa for that. And assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Okay. So, this topic is obviously a very vulnerable one and one that afflicts not only our community, but so many communities. And I'm going to begin tonight's talk very similarly to how I began the talk that we did for researchers and professionals last week. We did another talk on this topic last week, but we wanted to also kind of do one version of this using like a like as a public forum in a way, and to kind of like allow people to and just kind of who are in community to think about how they can prevent, attend to, and also respond to domestic violence concerns that are in our community. One of the things that I'll say off the bat, and it shouldn't be a surprise to folks here, is that we are always sort of condescending towards, right? As a community, we're often condescending towards survivor stories. And there is a culture that sort of, and what I mean by culture is not an ethno-linguistic culture or diaspora. What I mean by that is a culture of silence. That there's a sort of way that we respond to survivors, typically speaking. And of course, there are exceptions to that. But when people have the expectation that if they seek help, that there's going to be more consequences than there are avenues for healing, or avenues for relief, or avenues for safety, then people end up experiencing silence. One of the things that I have unfortunately experienced a number of times in my career is that when we talk about domestic violence, or research about domestic violence, or do a panel on domestic violence in a mental health conference, let's say, there's always somebody somewhere who says, we shouldn't be talking about this the way that we are because it's going to make our communities look bad. Let me address that to start. I get it. I do, because not in terms of, survivorship, directly, but in the sense of, if I say vulnerable stuff in front of folks from the dominant culture, it may be misused, especially to circulate xenophobic ideas about my people. However, when we are in our own homes, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked us to interrupt oppression, whether it's out in the world or in our houses, then that cute excuse to not address domestic violence when we are amongst each other doesn't fly. Why do we bring that up when we're talking to each other in our mosques, in our community centers, at conferences that are about our topics? If we are in front of other people and they're going to misuse and not be there for our communities, fine. I get it, right? There's this idea that oppression happens somewhere out there in the East, which ignores the high rate of violence, and that's just reports, the high rate of domestic violence that's here amongst the United States, right? There's, I think it's something around 4 or 5 out of 10 American women report that they've either experienced or are currently experiencing intimate partner violence or domestic violence, and that's American folks, right? So it's yes, so yes, of course, this sort of xenophobia says, well, that happens to people out there and not here. So of course, right, that concern of misunderstanding or reinforcing xenophobia is available. But I'll be honest with y'all, people who want to have that propaganda about how other cultures and other religions are archaic, they have that propaganda anyway. Whether you raise domestic violence up in your community to address and confront or not, people have that propaganda anyway. Even when we're saying nothing, they have propaganda, right? About archaic natures and culture and religion and all that. So when we are called to address what's happening in our homes, it's really important for us to understand what is happening. What I talked about last week was that unfortunately, in research, even in research about domestic violence, a lot of it is based on rates and typologies. So that might be a study that says there's 4 out of 10 or 6 out of 10, or the forms of violence are like, emotional abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse. And that is very important. However, what is missing often in the research about what's going on in survivors is the survivor's own voice about their experience, right? If I was, let's say, like we're doing something that is, okay, like if I were to say I traveled to such and such country, and you wanted to know what my particular experience was of my travels, wouldn't you ask me? You wouldn't ask somebody else. You'd be like, Zane, what was it like for you to travel there? You might have your own ideas about where I visited, but if you wanted to know about how I experienced something, wouldn't you ask me? Unfortunately, we don't ask survivors because that's part of disempowerment, right? Is to relegate and disenfranchise the voice of the person. They're disempowered by the experience of violence. They're disempowered by when they try to seek help, they're given consequences, like I said earlier. And when they're disempowered because even when we research about them, we don't ask them what it's like, right? So I was mentored, alhamdulillah, by 4 women of color, different backgrounds, to do with my dissertation when I was in graduate school, to center the voices of people and to reflect them. And of course, I had to name in my study that, I'm a man. I haven't experienced this same thing directly. I sort of called myself a insider outsider in the sense that like I have witnessed violence and experienced vicarious violence, and there has been domestic violence in my own extended family that I was witness to growing up. If I'm honest with you, not just extended family, but there is uh, you know, this idea that we need to also understand that people who directly experience this, they know what it's like to experience the disempowerment, and they also know what it's like to experience their own empowerment, right? And so when we ask them what it's like, that is a fundamental source of knowledge. To do this, we would have to sort of turn our community on its head. And instead of applying stigma to survivors' disclosures, we would have to open up more spaces where people can at least seek help and refuge for what's happening for them. So I want to show you all something, and I actually showed it to the group that met here last week. But let me show you all something that came out of my dissertation that I think may be useful in terms of understanding the approach that I am using for tonight. So if we look at this map, and I'm going to share my screen here in a second, but if we look at this map, this is from my dissertation. Let me go ahead and find it. And for those of you who are just joining us, we're going to be, I'm going to be sharing some information about my experience of interfacing with this topic. And then at the top of the hour, we'll be doing question and answer and conversation. But let me go ahead and find this for you. Okay. Ready to go. My apologies, y'all. I'm just going to find this map for you real quick. Bigger. Okay. So let's see here. Sorry, it's taking me a second to find it. Well, I guess let me start talking about what I'm going to show you. So there's this theorist, his name is Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and he talks about how experiences, especially like human development experiences, they happen not only based on what's happening in the microsystem, like between one person and their spouse or a parent and their child, but it's also based on how we are interacting out in the community. So, for example, if we are ignoring harms on violence, or ignoring harms on survivors in the mushit space or in the community space, that makes it easier for people to perpetrate violence in the home because they're not thinking about how, if they go out into the world, that they're going to have a consequence, right? This is also true about law. So that's called a macro system. So there's a larger layer of society. I'll give you an example. Like India did not have a specific domestic violence law until 2005. Right, it wasn't even considered illegal to harm your partner or harm your spouse, and so and there are also laws that exist in certain countries that make it so that if you are reporting, right, so like Pakistan, for example, has a law where, and inshallah, like it's being changed or something, but there's a law where if you are claiming that your spouse has harmed you, you can go to jail for hearsay if it's not proven. And then the rule is to post bail, you have to get a male member of your family to post bail for you, and which often could be the perpetrator, right? And so these type of power imbalances don't just exist in the home, they also exist outside in the world. And so they sort of have this reciprocal process, right? Alhamdulillah, I finally found it. My apologies, y'all, and thank you for being so patient. So if I go to here, so this is like, can y'all see this? Let's see, hold on. Here, can y'all see this right here? Let me just zoom in for y'all. So the idea here is that when you have things that are happening on the outside world, they affect the inside. And there's also things that happen on the inside world that affect the outside. Think about like polarization in America, for example, right? People who have vastly different beliefs, even in their own family. That reflects polarization that exists in the world, like countries that fight with each other and stuff, right? So when you have a polarized society, you're going to have polarized family members. Okay. If you have a violent society and you don't have laws that protect people when they're experiencing harm, you're going to have violent homes. Whatever you put in the ground is going to come out. That's the idea. There's a couple of words, academic words we use for that: isomorphism. The top affects the bottom affects the top, and reciprocally or whatever, right? But also another way to think about that is that we are always arrested in these systems. So an example of this that I really want to highlight today is this right here, this coping in secret. One of the xenophobic ideas about women of color, especially, is that they cope in secret because they're just following culture or stigma or whatever. In my study, that's not what the survivors said. They said they tried to locate support out here. Can you all see when I'm changing my mouse around? Okay, so they tried to locate support out here with family or with community. And when they were rebuffed or they experienced more consequences, they chose to cope in secret because it was safer than trying to get help. So they're not saying, hey, I chose to enjoy my abuse, which again comes from a xenophobic understanding of survivors, especially from Muslim communities, right? They're saying we tried and we were rebuffed. An example of this, and I shared this last week as well. An example of this is one of the survivors said something to the effect of, when I was experiencing abuse early in my relationship, I went to the imam and I said, this is what's happening. And the imam said, you're early in your marriage, try it out. That's your husband. Okay. And then when I came back later, several years later, I was told that why didn't you come earlier? This is your own fault that this has been happening for so long. So disempowerment doesn't just occur in the experience of violence itself. It also occurs because the survivor is told that their approach to seeking help is always wrong. They did it wrong. So we're disempowering the voice of the survivor, right? So it's really important then to have at least one, if not more, at least one family member that's like, it's a good thing that you're seeking services. Let me help you. Because it opens up all sorts of avenues that wouldn't be possible otherwise. Or maybe we should have services listed at the community center or at our mosque. But when you have leaders, and I'm not just trying to patronize and shame imams, because it's not just about them. It's about leaders in general, people who sit on boards, who have spent 30, 40 years ignoring violence. Maybe sometimes in their own homes and there's a projection happening, right? And so when we have a culture of silence and patronizing that happens, we are basically saying, red light, don't do that here. If you keep going and talking about this, you're going to experience consequences. You're the one that's going to get ticketed for it. But what we can do instead is all of us as adults can find avenues by challenging the spaces we occupy, whether it's our jobs, whether it's other people of influence that we know personally, whether it's in our own homes, to do something about it. Now, that sometimes comes with risks towards ourselves. And it's easier for me, I want to acknowledge, it's easier for me as a man to say that. But some of y'all know men that say nothing. And it's okay for them to experience some consequences if it means, oh, so-and-so, this person who I've known for 20 years doesn't like me for a week. Well, if it means that we're going to have less harm in our homes, maybe it's worth it. It's such a weird thing sometimes in our communities that we spend so much time praising each other for accolades and then are so afraid of using those accolades to interrupt something that's problematic. What's the point of the accolades? Malcolm X said, wouldn't it be so great that when we got our education, we would use it to benefit our homes and our communities instead of just being worried about losing the accolades we accrued? I don't know about y'all, but I don't believe I'm gonna like take this certificate with me to the grave. But I will take my deeds with me and what I saw with my eyes and was refused to talk about. Now, I want to acknowledge something that doesn't get talked about a lot in domestic violence research. That is that violence is not always one perpetrator to one survivor, right? So sometimes there's reciprocal abuse. It's between partners. Now, it's not always to the same degree. There's also something called situational violence, where a couple is not typically violent with each other, but certain situations bring out that pattern. There are also different degrees of violence. You can have a partner who is physically harming, sexually harming, emotionally harming, and financially threatening. And then the other person may like incidentally try to, react back. That happens too. But the research does not always encapsulate this because we have a hyper individualistic sense of that's the hero in the situation, that's the survivor, that's the perpetrator, and all that. The other thing to mention here, especially because we're talking about Muslim communities, and we're also talking about the sort of like consequence for survivors, is that sometimes the violence is being reinforced by one's own parents or one's own in-laws, and there's not just one perpetrator, but a sort of a spindle or a cycle of perpetrators that are making the survivor's life hell. Sometimes violence happens by threat to one's child. If you do this, or if you say something, here's what's going to happen to your kid, or here's what's going to happen to the rights of your kid. So people use power they already have had in their life, like being a man or having money or coming from a family that's well off or well known, to threaten that if you try to say something, we're going to shame you publicly. This happens all the time. There's this idea that's swirling out there because people have, fears of like liberal feminism. But I don't need liberal Western feminism to tell me the things my religion has already told me, that certain things are not allowed in our homes and that we should interrupt them. Right. And so, unfortunately, people will, what we call like survivor shame or victim shame or victim blame, that person had an agenda. They're making this stuff up. One of the things that I said last week, and I want to repeat it here today, is you do not need to know every nook, cranny, or detail to believe a survivor. I'm going to say that again. You don't have to know every nook, cranny, or detail to believe a survivor. Because, and I'm going to give an example here. There's a difference between validation and total agreement. Total agreement is not required to support a survivor. You don't have to say, I saw what you saw, I experienced what you experienced. I sometimes joke, not joke, but I sometimes make the example with some of my students who are becoming therapists. If validation and agreement were the same thing, your religion would change every session because your clients have different religions. It's not about agreeing with the survivor about everything they're detailing to you. It's about giving them dignity that when they feel unsafe and they've told you that they're unsafe, you honor that they're not feeling safe. That doesn't require a lot, actually. But we have this idea that, well, what if I'm like green lighting something I don't know the full story about? Okay, you can be concerned or anxious about that for the next week. Meanwhile, the survivor is becoming more harmed. That's a you projection that you thought it was about total agreement or non-agreement. Is it true? Is it not true? That's an anxiety of the person who's receiving the information. The survivor is going through a completely different story. They want some help, some help. And here we are worried about, am I going to agree with them totally or not? That is a binary that we are projecting on it. You don't have to agree totally to, hey, it sounds like you're unsafe. I'm just going to model this. That sounds like you're feeling unsafe. What do you need? I didn't say in what I just said there, oh, I totally agree with you that your husband's an abuser. He always has been. Like, no, you don't have to say that sort of thing. You can just say, sounds like you're feeling unsafe. How can I help you? If we had more people just have the ability to do that, I believe our communities would be more well. I believe if kids witnessed other people be able to say something like that, our communities would be more well. But instead, we have other things being talked about. We have had public murders that have happened, not only in intimate partner violence situations, but sometimes when there's been divorcees, and they have been lethal situations that have been made public to us. And suddenly it's like, how the NRA will like show up right after a school shooting and be like, oh no, we're worried about losing our guns. Sometimes Muslim people do the same thing. Oh no, a public just domestic violence situation. We have to remind everybody how about this is not really an issue, and we're going to be look really bad. So let's get out in front of it and make sure our khutbahs are not about this. That's absurd, right? So this culture of silence needs to be interrupted in some way, right? So we all have different talents. We are also located to these topics differently. Like I said earlier, it's easier for me as a man, right, to challenge other men without worrying about what's going to happen to me. But we all need to think about what is our sphere of influence and what are the things that we're willing to sacrifice in order to do good. That old saying, in Islam, right? It's like, if you can't change something with your hands, you can change it with your speech. If you can't change it with your speech, you can change it with your heart. I'm really concerned that like a lot of people don't even do it at that level. Now, I've been talking a lot about what's in the way, but I also want to highlight there's so many good efforts that are happening right now in our community that don't get enough spotlight. Peaceful Families Project has been around for 20 plus years, and their entire mission is about highlighting domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and preventing it from happening. I'm part of the Peaceful Families Project now. I'm actually doing a study right now on the male attitudes about violence, because we need to know what males' attitudes are, right? Now, there's a bias in that. The type of men that are likely to participate in a study like that probably already are the type of men that are trying to interrupt something in their homes or in their communities. But we need to know what men's perspectives are, because when men validate violence, it happens. Let me actually take an off ramp real quick and say this. Of course, survivors are not just women, of course. And what is simultaneously true is that violence is usually gendered. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Not all, I'm going to say it again, not all survivors of violence, family violence, intimate partner violence, dating violence, marital violence, rape violence, are women. However, violence and its, trimmings, if you will, its cadence is gendered. Both of those things can be true at the same time. We don't have to fight between the two of them. There's a disproportionate nature, right? One, because of reporting. Men don't always report. That's number one, when they experience harm, right? Because it's like a threat to their masculinity or something. There's a lot of research and information out there about like the underreporting of male survivors. But with that being said, the disproportionate nature of who is more likely to be harmed is also still gendered. But if we're talking about family violence, it's also about children, who are the least powerful in the system as well, right? And so both of those things can be happen at the same time. When we have an opportunity at 9 o'clock Eastern time, it might be a good thing to hear from other people about what efforts they're doing in the community, so this group can walk away with some hope, right? There are some really good efforts. I've been a mental health professional in the Muslim community now, if I count grad school, um, 15 years, probably 15 years, right? And so that's I have seen tremendous shifts, not only in the efforts that are being done, but people who are specifically studying domestic violence, more Muslim mental health professionals, period, social workers, social service providers. I will say one thing that we do not include in our story enough is that Black American Muslims have been part of social services 30, 40, 50 years before children of immigrants are like, oh, we started this thing, but we don't always include them as part of our Muslim American story, which is another problem, because they've already laid out a lot of template for what we should be doing as well. But we have this like, oh, we were the first. I mean, that's harmful, because there's already amazing things that are happening. I'll give you an example. Islamic Social Services of America has been around for a long time. Sister Nisa Nadir is a mentor to a lot of people, and she precedes all of the Muslim mental health stuff that you're seeing, this webinar and all that. Because of her, we have a lot of things that we have, right? And that comes from the community in Arizona, right? There are sister agencies on domestic violence that have been around for 20 plus years, right? There's Hamdard and Upnagar that are in Chicago. There is My Family Services, there's Saheli, there's Sawera. I can name 20. And obviously I'm more privy to that because of what I do. But some of this stuff is Googleable. Muslim services for domestic violence. And a lot of times we don't want to even put up the effort for that. But I want to just, highlight, instead of doing the doom and gloom, there are a lot of, alhamdulillah, some great avenues. But one of the things that I've witnessed is, even if those great avenues are available to us, we don't spotlight them. We don't do the basic work as a community to say, hey, here's some things that are around. And you can do a lot of that stuff anonymously, especially in today's day and age. You text somebody a link, it can save their life, right? So there's that. Okay. Another thing to think about here, and somebody had mentioned it direct message to me, and so I want to highlight it because it is really important, that a lot of things about violence aren't specifically things that sprouted up today. There are patterns of intergenerational violence that have happened across time. I know that to be true in my own family, what we call them genograms, family tree, right? That there are things that are modeled from recent, families, recent generations that trickle down. There's a saying in systems family therapy that no pattern can be interrupted until you interrupt it. Basically, the idea is uh, difference makes the difference. The only way you can change something is by changing it. So if you are not doing anything about patterns, either in our communities or our families, they're going to continue. I had a really good mentor share the difference with me once. She said it's not an expectation that if you've experienced harm that you're going to perpetrate harm. That's too much of a robotic explanation. People aren't pre-programmed to go and do harm if they experienced harm. That's actually not true. Actually, most survivors do not perpetrate harm. However, it is also simultaneously true that the increased likelihood of future family violence happens when you've witnessed violence or experienced violence. So I hope that is making sense. I know it's kind of a weird both and. It's an increased likelihood. And likelihood can increase by 1%, 1% to 2%, right? That doesn't mean that most survivors then commit harm. That's actually not true. Most survivors do not. Okay, so I want to make that distinction. So it's not like, oh, I experienced harm, I'm going to take it out on somebody. That's actually a fallacy and it's not possible, but the likelihood does increase. I hope that makes sense. So like you could have 1 out of 100. Now it's 2 out of 100. You still have 98 out of 100 that don't. Just for example, as a for example, right? But the likelihood increased, but most people still aren't doing it. Okay. Yes. Okay. The other problem that afflicts our community. So I mentioned our own stigmas, our own silencing. I mentioned what survivors said in my study. I mentioned, alhamdulillah, the good things that are happening in our community that can help us destigmatize by spotlighting efforts that are already happening in our community. And I also mentioned, for us to think critically about where we can have a sphere of influence, right? And some of the smallest acts, and this is obviously an Islamic concept too, right? Small and consistent deeds are really important. So if you don't want to go and like have a tiff with somebody who's violent in your home because it might have a consequence to you or something like that, you can at least commit to something that's happening in your community on a consistent basis. Like be the person that, like shares a link to a WhatsApp group every month about domestic violence. Things like that are easy. They don't have a barrier to entry. They're easy to do. And they can save somebody's life. So the other thing that I want to highlight is about culturally sensitive services. Unfortunately, the visible domestic violence agencies and the research about those agencies and people who typically, when they go and they get grant money and they're competing with smaller organizations that are also trying to get that same money, they're not always culturally sensitive, the larger domestic violence initiatives. For example, they don't always have translators. For example, they don't always consider that if somebody separates from an abusive situation, that they could get deported. Let me explain that one. If you are in a relationship where you are a contingent resident based on your spouse's citizenship before you get your own citizenship, and you separate from the relationship and you don't have other legal resources to keep you in the United States, you can get deported. And if your child is an American citizen, they stay with an abuser. Unfortunately, most domestic violence services that are visible do not take that into account. They also don't take into account transportation issues. One of the ways that abuse happens is by withholding the ability for a survivor to freely roam. I have I do supervision in my clinic, and I have a supervisee, a brand new therapist, straight out of master's, who has a client right now. And the only time she has autonomy is when she's in her therapy session. Because she's about this woman is the client. She's about 58 years old. So she doesn't qualify for adult protective services. So like a mental health professional can't like do an APS call on her behalf. And her husband drives her everywhere, threatens violence, used to hit her, threatens and looms it on her that if she acts out of line, that he's going to hit her again. And also controls all of her bank accounts and everything like that. So the only time that she has autonomy is when she comes into the therapy session and speaks her piece. Now, there are some exceptions. There's more to the story. So what this means is that domestic violence agencies should think about transportation issues. Like where are you located? How do people get to you? Do you have like maps that are on your website about how people can get to you? Do you have virtual hours? Like, what are you thinking about, right? Unfortunately, we don't always have that. It's like, people have to have a car in order to like, access something. Okay. Another piece I want to bring up that I didn't bring up yet, and actually let's take a pause because I know that I'm going really fast, and the people who know me in this room know that I can do that. We'll just digest for 5 seconds, and I'll move on to the next thing. Okay. So another thing that I want to mention is that often you'll hear from people these sort of extreme and not so helpful uh, uh, requests for survivors. Well, if you don't like it, why don't you just leave? Or um, we should go and physically confront that abuser. Well, here's the problem with both of those things. If you hastily say to a survivor they need to leave their situation and you haven't done a thorough assessment of if they have a car, a place to go, what's going to happen to their kid, what if the place they go is like, I don't know, their in-laws place or their own parents place, which by the way sometimes are also reinforcing the abuse, and you haven't done a thorough assessment, we know that one of the scariest times, and this is, you can look this up, one of the scariest times where harms happen, an increased likelihood of harm happening, is when a survivor tries to separate from their relationship because the perpetrator feels threatened, their ego is threatened, and that's where a lot of harms can happen. We had a public situation where somebody was divorced, and after the divorce, the dude had murdered his ex-wife in Illinois, right? This is a phenomenon. Of course, it's not always murder. It can happen in other ways too, right? Public shaming, physical harm, harm to child. So if you're like, oh, why don't you just leave? That is a callous thing to say to survivor if you have not done a thorough assessment of what is going to happen next. It's easy for us to say from a distance. Now, what you can do instead is say, let's talk through what is going to help you feel safer. Here are some resources that I know about. And then the survivor who knows their situation, right, more intimately, can make choices about where to go. Now, it's kind of this both and. We want to be available to people without taking their autonomy away. If you take people's autonomy away and you say like, well, you better listen to me and get the hell out of the situation. Now we're almost reproducing the power dynamic that they're experiencing already in their homes. So there has to be a both and. I'm available here for you, and I want to help you with resources. Let's figure out a way for you to experience safety adequately without an increased harm, which is a hard thing to do. But it's an interesting thing though. Sometimes when you slow down and look at all the pieces, the safety can be accessed a little bit more efficiently, actually. Now, let me talk about the other thing. Let's go beat the crap out of the person, whatever. Okay, fine. When that's all said and done, guess who has to live with that person? And guess who they're going to take it out on? Right? So when we need to remove the callousness. We have this extreme in our community sometimes of like callous, extreme, immediate, hasty, what we think is advocacy, and the other end, silence. You know, what can help us in between all of this, and I'll go back to a statement I said earlier, ask survivors about what they need and what their experiences are and what they need from those experiences. Now, survivors aren't always going to know. But when we say, hey, I want to know about your story, we signal to them that their story matters. And then they can speak with us and we can collaborate about how to proceed after that. Okay. So just to kind of review some things, okay. We need to spotlight culturally sensitive services that take into account what a Muslim survivor's experience is. Violence is not always perpetrated against women, although it is gendered. Silence allows violence to happen at a higher rate. Advocating is not the same thing as hasty, callous acts on behalf of a survivor because you can put them in more immediate danger that day. It's better for people to have an understanding of all the resources that are available to them. Like, again, do they have a car, a place to go? Have they filed a no contact order or something, right? Just for you all to be aware, in most states between the ages of 18 and 60 or 18 and 65, it depends on the state, I believe in Washington, the age is 60 for adult protective services and 65 in some other states. But between the ages of 18 and 60, legally, the law says that it is the adult's own responsibility to protect themselves. Now, I'm not saying that's correct, ethical, moral, whatever, but that is what the law states. So a lot of times when police show up for domestic violence disturbance, they basically say, cut it out and leave, right? No, I'm not saying that to say don't call the police if somebody's in danger or their life is in danger. I'm not saying don't do that. But we also should be thoughtful about how things actually work in the real world. Um, and rely on services that we have. Now we have a lot of people in this, well, we have a number of people in this room, right, who are interested in this topic. And you all may be more likely than the people who are not in this room to have some information about domestic violence services. Share them with people who do not have that information. That's one of the simplest things that we can do. Like I said, put it in a WhatsApp group, send it in an email, right? Refer people to studies about things, right? And I'm happy to, for anybody who wants to drop their email, send resources your way after our conversation is over. Not all of the resources I have are specific to Muslim communities, but I have a lot of research and also research articles about culturally sensitive domestic violence, and also examples of like hotlines and places that people can go to seek services in a more of a creative way that's responsive to our own conditions. But yeah, so just to repeat some of the themes, right? We really want to be interested in people's own autonomy, including their own story. When we don't ask survivors what they've been through, there's going to be a likelihood that we miss their needs because we haven't asked them what it's like, what it's like for them, right? And it's not simply, and I'm going to go return to this image that I had. It's not simply the things that are disempowering or hurting the survivors. We also want to hear from them, and I put it in italics here. It's kind of hard to see. Let me do this. Ecology of empowerment. Oh, I guess I didn't name it that way. Hold on a second. Well, let me just show you on this thing. So the italicized ones here were mostly talked about in my study. They're mostly talked about in terms of what the survivors tapped into in order to support themselves. So like when folks talked about like, here's how I access support, and they told a story, right? That's also knowledge. So it's not just knowledge about what harmed them. It's also knowledge about what helped them at times. Some of these were both, like family could be something that reinforces violence. Family can also be something that helps you experience relief and safety away from violence, right? Every survivor in this study had specific ways of surviving that were unique to them. And interestingly enough, they spoke about choosing to cope in secret as a way to avoid other and additional harms. And of course, we don't want that, right? We don't want survivors to be alone and isolated. So when we pair something like, the things that they're trying to do on their own with locating family and locating community, even if it's something simple as a mosque has a list of resources, simple thing to do. You can just have it on your website, or you can have it, posted somewhere, right? These are simple things to do that can make a big deal, because then survivors who may otherwise feel like they're isolated can go out into the community and see a signal that says, oh, there's people that are here that would help me. So it's not just about ecologies of abuse, it's also about ecologies of survival and empowerment. So actually that's the word I use, survival. So let me see if I can bring up some of the stuff that the survivors said here. Hold on. Okay, this is another map. So I'm gonna zoom in on is it not working? Sorry, I'm using my fingers. My apologies, y'all. Give me 1 second. Let me stop share for a second. Okay. I'm zooming out. Zoom back in here. Okay, perfect. I'm a millennial, I'm not a Gen Zer, so like I'm like half fast with technology and half not fast. So anyway, so if you look at the right side here, the ecology of survival. So the reason that you see some bidirectional arrows is because in this study, the survivors basically said that like one type of resource helped them access another type of resource, right? So for example, like um, locating community and family might help you with your personal processing, which might help you create your own unique ways of surviving that are unique to your circumstances, your family, and your situation. So basically, I talked to family and community. They were really helpful. That made me think about what to do. And then I was able to access ways of getting out of my situation. And getting out of one situation sometimes means being out of a relationship. But I'm going to repeat something I said earlier. We're also talking about family violence in your own home. So it's not always a spouse. Actually, one of the participants mainly talked about her parent abusing her mom, actually. So this also happens in our homes, right? In collectivism, we have so many beautiful strengths like collective storytelling, collective traditions, gathering at each other's houses, praying together, traveling together, seeing our being brought into two different families when people get married. But we also have unique challenges because violence can be collective, right? So these arrows are just demonstrating that things can happen. Now, this one's an interesting one, social standing. And I think if I did the study again, I think I would try to pull on other words that the survivors used for this. I tried my best to make themes based on the survivors' like own words. And again, there are quotes for each one of these categories in my study. But social standing, I think another way to put this is like social resources. So the interesting thing is that there's a paradox that people who have social standing, economic social standing, or like they come from a quote unquote good family, whatever the heck that means. If they experience social standing, often that sort of, there's a lot of gatekeeping, like, oh, but we have such a good reputation. Don't ruin that reputation. But the irony is those are also the people who have the greatest ability to go and access resources because they know people that can help someone who's in distress and experience abuse. So there's a paradox there. So if we're thinking about it in terms of the ecology of survival, if we have enough community members who are thinking like, alhamdulillah, I'm blessed, I could use that blessing to help the survivor, instead of thinking, alhamdulillah, I'm blessed, I hope I don't lose my blessing by pointing out that we have harms in our community, a lot could change even from that, just from that reframe, right? That it's maybe using the resources you've been blessed with to help people who are struggling rather than using the resources that you have to fear losing the resources that you have. And I know that's easier for me to just say in a talk like this, and it's harder for people to discern which things to give up. But I'm a big believer, especially we're in a setting, about Muslim survivors, right? That when you give, Allah gives you back more. You don't lose anything by giving to people. That's our belief. That's an Islamic belief. That's not Zain talking. That when you donate something for the sake of people, when you serve Allah by serving people, Allah gives you things in return. That is a belief that all Muslims share. So when we say things like, I can't do anything, which is a very totalist thing to say, anything about it, because if I do, I'm going to lose what I have. It sounds pretty un-Islamic to me, to be honest with you. Now, I can respect people saying, this is a challenging thing for me to do, and I don't know where to start. Yeah, but at least from there, we can have a conversation with each other and help each other out and brainstorm. But we stop the conversation altogether. I can't do anything. It's going to hurt my life. I'm not even able to share a link on a WhatsApp group. All right, now what are we doing there? Right? There are so many things that are available to us in terms of how to support survivors in 2024 that were not available even in 2014 or in 2004 or 1994, right? Things have changed. And so it's important for us to think about the small and consistent ways that we can help. Even if it's about telling people about agencies that already exist. There's no new stigma that you're tapping into there. You can just be like, hey, this thing exists. So it's been around, right? Even amongst South Asian Muslim women, there are sister agencies all around the country. I didn't know that because growing up, people didn't talk about violence, right? And if it happened, it's like, shh, no, it's going to make us look bad, right? So when I started studying this, I was like, oh my God, there were like 25 to 30 plus. And those are just the ones I can research that are specifically catered towards South Asian women's experiences. There's a organization called REWA, that is specifically for refugee survivors, right? There's organizations that are people who are being abused and trafficked, right? There's what's it called? Apichaya, which is Asian Pacific Islander survivors of domestic violence. They're here, they exist. They're not something we have to think doesn't exist and have to like create. And it's good if we have new initiatives. Alhamdulillah, it's always good to have new initiatives. But sometimes we tell this story that these things don't exist and there are no avenues for survivors. And then you tell the survivor that, they're going to think they have to deal with it on their own. So what if you could highlight the stuff that's going on? Right? Like I challenge everyone here, and you may be already privy to it, but like challenge everyone here to like look up, what's available, right? So it's really important for us to make it more regular, normal for us to care about oppression that happens in our homes and interrupting it, right? Now, I have a lot of respect for those folks who, at their own maybe social discrediting that happens from people around them, make sure to talk about these subjects publicly. If a child hears an imam growing up saying, we have to stop the oppression in our homes, yes, maybe that imam is going to take flack from people on a masjid board for that next week. But that kid heard that and remembered it for the rest of their life, they're probably more likely to interrupt some violence that's happening amongst friends or in their own family as they develop and grow. I remember being 18 years old and I went to an Eid khutbah, and the Eid khutbah was about white supremacy. It was oh my gosh, who was it? Hakeem Jackson. Okay. And I was at this khutbah, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, just like this is pretty radical, right? And it was like the early 2000s, right? And I was wondering about like, what are people gonna say, I'm so glad I was a youth who heard that, because it helped me make sense of a lot of things that are happening right now in the world at a young age. The signaling that we do and what we say is okay to talk about goes a long way in the socialization of human beings and their development. When you have leaders, or and a leader is not just an imam or a president of something or a researcher, an academic. All of us are leaders in certain spheres. There are people we don't even know are looking up to us. You could be somebody's like Ammo or Baji or something, and the way that you speak about things green lights to them what's okay and what's not okay in our development. That also is leadership, right? How we model things. I studied human development. That's what my PhD is in. And we know that 5-year-olds don't remember things based on like verbals. Oh, did you remember the meaning of what you're doing? No, the 5-year-olds don't digest things like that. Actually, they digest things based on modeling, what they see other adults doing, and they look at it and they soak it all in. That's how they do it. That's how they learn, right? They model, they repeat, right? So similarly, if you hear at any age, any critical period of your life, whether you're a child, an older child, a prepubescent, a teenager, a coming of age adult, like at all these critical periods of your life, what are the messages that you're receiving from your community that brings up, what is a type of development about what is allowed and what's not allowed in our communities, right? So anyways, I digress. I hope this was beneficial for you all to hear, get reinforced, to talk about. We talked about intergenerational violence too, and and the one thing I'll say about intergenerational violence, right, is that because it's a pattern, right? Um, one wrench in the pattern can disrupt it. Maybe not every part of it, but I'll give you a symbolic example. If you're in a room that's pitch black, completely pitch black, that is the system, that is the pattern. It's completely pitch black. If there's even a tiny glimmer of light, that's where your eye is going to go. That's also something to think about when we're interrupting intergenerational violence, right? It's a pattern, it's a pattern, it's a pattern, it's everywhere. No one's interrupting it. So the smallest of interruptions will stand out. Don't condescend the smallest efforts. They make a big deal. And so, because they can send a ripple effect, right? Even if it's one family member who refuses to perpetrate or to validate harm, that can make a big difference. It made a big difference in my own life. Actually, I want to say this before we move to question and answer. A lot of the things I'm saying to you today, I could be like, well, it's because I researched this, or I did my domestic violence, or I was mentored in my dissertation by amazing mentors. But you know what made the biggest difference? Two things. My mom, who refused to allow violence as part of how we developed. And number two, my father was a social service provider. So we helped families, he helped families who were experiencing domestic violence and harms. Now, the diaspora that we're part of, the family tree that I'm part of is more complicated than the story that I'm telling you. But those signals that I got from my parents made a big deal. I don't think I would be here talking about this topic if it wasn't for those signals that I got from my parents. And so let's say that theoretically, my father theoretically, thought exercise, is the only person who brings this up in his own nuclear family or family tree growing up, that violence needs to stop and we need to help people who are struggling, who are experiencing harm. Well, obviously, it sent a ripple effect in my life. My sister's life is also a social worker, right? Like these are things that send off a message or a signal. So you may not always see the impact that you're having to prevent future harms. But the way that we speak about things and the things that we do out in the community do have an impact on the people that come after us as well. Anyhow, I'm going to digress there. And Wafa, if you could restate some of the ground rules for questions, we can move into that for the next half an hour, inshallah. But thank you all for being so patient during this hour and listening to me go all over the place. And hopefully it was beneficial.
Jazakumullah khair. And so inshallah we'll go right into our Q&A for the next half an hour. Feel free to either send in your question to Dr. Zain or to raise your hand and say it aloud on the mic. Inshallah, we'll be taking one question at a time just to leave room for as many folks to answer or to ask any questions that they may have. Given that this is a sensitive topic, folks may be coming at this from different places, different experiences, whether professionally or personally. Inshallah, let's try to all be respectful of everyone's opinions, perspectives, and lived experiences, inshallah. So without further ado, we'll take any questions folks have. And Sister Syra, I see your hand up.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Syra here. Thank you so much again for organizing this talk. And I'm sorry I missed most of it, but I realized there was at my end a mix up of the dates. I do see clients, especially women, having lack of trust and self-confidence issues a lot when they had domestic violence in marriages in Muslim context. And then I think more of a strength um, uh, based growth that I see is that they themselves want that cycle not to be repeated in their daughters' lives and also sons' lives. My question is, child development background, definitely, Dr. Shamoon, you have, when you're writing and everything. I've heard you before. You're very knowledgeable about this topic in general, and also trauma and narrative pain project that you have. My hope is that we can look at it, the progress or the evolution, the like we say in the narrative therapy, for the clients to be not necessarily a step forward and another step forward and another step forward, because somebody may have learning disabilities, or they have family pressure, or they have children who are special needs. And so whatever, let's say, a DV client wants to do to try to walk away from her past. Majority of the cases are female, but I know sometimes men can also be at the receiving end of domestic violence, and in the Desi culture as well. The question is, how can we encourage people, given all of our training skills and non-judgmental attitudes and a very wide open scope of life circumstances that we have to keep in mind, plus the sensitivity of clients, that we can engender in them a sense of self-confidence. That seems to be for me, even though eventually it comes about, but it takes a rather longer duration, maybe 1 or 2 years of therapy, which is fine. But am I missing something in my work, that where, or is it just like the 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 multiple layers of trauma, once they are worked through, it takes the client that much longer to eventually make decisions of moving forward with career plans, or move away to another city, or even decide about entertaining the idea of trusting people again, and how to handle family ties, both with in-laws and their own families, for the sake of kids. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sister Sarah, for the question and the reflection. When we're talking about how to promote confidence in folks, confidence is it's one of those things that we can't see visibly, but we can have actions that are associated to it, right? That of course, when people have individual resources like therapy, that helps. And some people are able to access things quicker than others, depending on their circumstances and also depending on the lives that they've had. And like you adequately mentioned, aptly mentioned, that some survivors, they're experiencing abuse on top of other life stressors they're already experiencing. Like I mentioned earlier, that some people who are abused are also being trafficked, or some people are being abused by their spouse, but were also abused growing up, or something like that. There are many other examples. Or we mentioned different forms of abuse, economic and physical, right? They can happen at the same time. Okay, so when we're talking about confidence, again, there's not one answer to this. So I'm just sharing what's on my mind for now. So it's not total, the total response to this. But it needs not to be just an individual endeavor, lifting up people's confidence. If I want to become, I don't know, this is a terrible analogy because it doesn't speak to the gravity of the situation. But if I want to be a good basketball player, there have to be gyms. If I want to be a good swimmer, there have to be pools. Somebody's got to put a pool somewhere. If I want to be more confident in myself as a person, there have to be signals in the community that I can go and do something with that confidence. That's why I mentioned the simple idea of having a resource sheet, or I personally believe, in all these mosques that have social halls and revamped chandeliers, you can't have somebody on a volunteer basis be a social service person. Like, we have people in our community now, like we can have a signal to people that as you're working on your internal story, there's somebody there for you can talk to for free. Sometimes an imam can work like this, but that's a gendered reality too. And so, like, why not have men and sisters that are available to people? And there are some mosques that have done a good job of modeling the possibility of this, but they don't always get highlighted. But I think that's the kind of thing that it needs to not, and that's sort of the spirit of our talk today, right? It's that it cannot just be an individual endeavor. Even something like individual confidence is arrested in the signals that we give to people. Bell Hooks is one of my favorite writers, says that the number one attachment in life is not our romantic partner, that the number one attachment in life is community, and that it ought to be the case that we live in a society of reciprocal care, that it is not a radical act for me to give care to someone and ask for me to be cared for. We have a lot of modeling in that in our sunnah, actually. Prophet ﷺ had experienced a type of dysregulation upon getting the message and went to his spouse and said, "Cover me." And that's the greatest man to walk the earth. So we should definitely be telling our community that it's okay to go and seek help and care and support and warmth from others. So we need to set up channels that demonstrate that warmth, whether it's in the mosque or in the community center or in our newsletters, you know, and and inshallah, like even like recurrent talks like these, right? Like, having them happen more often, that we don't wait for a year for a conference, for a special breakout room to talk about domestic violence, that because it's happening so often, then our signals to help survivors also need to happen as often, right? So that's my answer, is that there need to be communal actions and things that are set up that signal to survivors that their development of confidence does not just happen on their own endeavors. It has to be something that we set up in the community. And if you are aware, if people in this room are aware of those types of endeavors, share them, spread them, let people know about them. But there's more to say about this, Sister Syra. I mean, we could probably have a whole conversation about all the ways that we can help people's confidence.
Sure.
But
No,
again,
Jazakallah khair. Very good. And I will share some resources you're welcome to pass along, inshallah, later. Jazakallah. Thank you so much.
Walaikum Jazakallah for sharing those with us.
Sister Nilam, I think I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. This has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you, Brother Zain, for all that you have provided. The information has been invaluable. One thing that I would like to add to the conversation is the idea of domestic violence prevention within families. Through my work, what I have found is that sometimes it's forgotten that there are certain practices that we can develop within families that are preventative. And to that end, I've actually developed a curriculum called Bonds of Kinship, which is all about creating positive family relationships through skill building within an Islamic framework. And, through my experience with that, it's been really heartening to see certain levels of transformation where, for example, people take for granted that, physical discipline is part and parcel of family life, for instance. Whereas actually what they then realize and come to understand that that's a choice that one makes and that there are alternatives to that type of discipline. And also that it's, as I mentioned, a preventative practice. And so from day one, these ideas can be put within the family circle. And this is also in line with our Islamic tradition. And obviously, through the Sunnah of the Prophet, we can learn so much about, for example, the treatment of children, the treatment of one's spouse, which are demonstrated without harm being included in the picture. And so I just wanted to throw that in there, that, it's something that we can be proactive about when we're thinking about preventing domestic violence and countering it. Thank you. Oh, and I'm happy to share that curriculum if anyone's interested. So the first original version was developed in 2016, and that was for general parents and caregivers. I also have offshoots for youth from elementary age all the way up to the teens. And I recently completed a premarital curriculum, which is founded on the same basis about creating positive family relationships. So if there is interest, do reach out to me and I would be happy to provide a copy to you. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Neelam, for adding that to our conversation. Yes, please do share that with us. I think that, the more that we can see different curriculums that represent prevention and intervention, the more that this type of culture, whatever the opposite of silencing is, right, can also spread, inshallah. So please share that with us. That would be an honor for us to receive that information. So thank you for that.
Any other questions? And you're more than welcome to either unmute yourself and ask or send it in the chat, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Walaikum
Walaikum
salam.
salam.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shamoon. Jazakallah khairan. MashaAllah, my first time joining in the webinar series was last Thursday, and alhamdulillah, I'm here tonight listening to another amazing presentation. I'm in Dallas, Texas, and we have the Texas Muslim Women's Foundation. They are also very big on domestic violence awareness. And today in my email, I received like a PSA, multicultural PSA, just videos highlighting domestic violence in Arabic, in Chinese, in different languages. So my own suggestion is if we can also make the work that we are doing in the field of social work, and especially in this field, domestic violence, if we can get more people who speak different languages, or just to create more awareness for those who speak Arabic and Urdu and Hindi and African languages, if they can implement many languages in their work, that would be helpful, because we have so many people moving into the United States, and the majority of them are well educated. They are very, very literate. But the only thing that they are struggling with is the English language. And not knowing how to speak English doesn't mean one is an illiterate. It's just that they are in a country where English language is the dominant country and they don't speak it, and that's normal. That's okay. So if we can have people in our various Muslim communities who might even not be social workers by profession, but they have this heart to help other people and they speak the language of the person who needs help, that would be helpful, because these videos I watched earlier on, they were really mind-blowing. Different languages like Taiwanese, Vietnamese, Chinese, and if the chat can be open for everybody so I can send the information, because I think I tried to send the information on the chat, but I only see that it's limited to the co-host. So Sister Wafa, please, if you can open the chat so that I can send more information about the Texas Muslim Women's Foundation, and also a link to the various videos that they've all presented. Jazakumullah khairan.
Wayakum. Yes, thank you for mentioning the chat, sister, because I just sent the curriculum I'd mentioned, but Brother Zain, you were the only person I could send it to.
Yeah, I think we're
So,
gonna open the chat for this portion. That's on me. So we're gonna change the settings now, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
Welcome. Thank you, Sister Mariam, for mentioning the Texas Women's Foundation. Those are the type of things that I think people, if they see it, they can see that there's models that already exist in our community that are vast, that have been around and have been doing good work. And I'm really glad that you mentioned language, because another barrier that happens at domestic violence services, as usual, although better than not having services, is that they haven't always they don't always have those considerations that are there. There's a lot of people, again, we talked about this earlier in our talk today, that the assumption that survivors just are going to take it and don't do anything about it. Well, it also depends on these things, like can they communicate about what's happening to them to a provider? If they can't communicate, then how can we do that? For people who are professionals in this work, it doesn't actually take much to sometimes request a translator in services. If you whether you're working in the court system or you're doing family therapy or something like that, sometimes you can seek some of these things out and get a translator. And so services that have that are really good models for us as a community that and it's true, right? Think about all the places that Muslim diasporas are large, right? Indonesia being one of them, right? Or places all around the world where the diasporas have made their way to survivors that are here. We need to be able to speak those languages and provide that's another signal, right? We have this translator. Oh, survivor can speak to that person, right? It's a door that's closed if we don't have it. And I really appreciate Sister Mariam for you bringing that up. Before we go to the next question, I wanted to point out one thing that somebody had direct messaged me. And then I also want to give Sister Donna the floor to talk about some work that she's involved with as well, and then we'll go to BB. So the thing that I wanted to mention is that and I should have mentioned this earlier. Of course, violence is not just physical and sexual. It's not just financial. It's also emotional, verbal, et cetera, et cetera. There's a famous wheel of power and control that it's actually been adapted by Peaceful Families Project to talk about global wheels of power and control and Zionism and stuff like that too, which is pretty cool to see that application. But of course, it exists in our homes, and so the original wheel of power control demonstrates that when people start to take power away from people in ways that are like either emotional or physical, emotional or verbal, that physical harm is actually a neighbor to that. So a lot of times that we think about, oh, it's not really harm if it's not physical. We know it is understood that it is a culture of violence. So even if somebody is verbal in their violence, that is actually a signal that it might become physical real quick or sexual. Not always, right? But the idea is that person's autonomy, control, and power, their power is being taken from them. Their dignity is being taken from them. And so when one method may work to a certain degree, and a perpetrator starts to do something emotional or withhold something, it can also start to become violent over time. And by the way, even if it doesn't become violent or sexual, we need to stop looking at emotional violence like it's something small. Emotional violence can stay with you for your entire life and affect all of your relationships for the rest of life. So somebody had mentioned that to me. If anybody wants to add anything to that, we can definitely have that conversation. I want to just give the floor really quickly to Sister Donna. I know you wanted to talk about some of the work that you were doing, and then we'll go to the next question.
Hi, everyone. I'm here in New Haven, Connecticut. I've been working with refugees and immigrants for the past 20 years. Most are Muslim from Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq, and Syria. And my experience has been when women disclose partner violence, the community's response is to bombard her with pressure to stay in the marriage and share their own experiences of domestic violence in their marriages. And when the woman doesn't want to stay in the marriage or wants to get help, she's been shunned from the community. Even community leaders, like there are women that I work with that are community leaders in their own communities, and it doesn't matter. They have been shunned, even though they've been giving and generous and kind and supportive to everyone else. So I'm just wondering if anyone has done any group interventions in communities. I know that the one-to-one is important. We've done a lot of that, but has anyone done anything like in a mosque or in a community center, almost like a domestic violence literacy, like just to raise awareness? Yeah, so that's my question. Thanks so much for taking my question.
Yeah, let's open the floor for a second. If anybody wants to share about that, if there's been any of these types of sort of actions that have happened in a community setting. And I also just want to highlight the piece about like we need more like 2 years after, 5 years after, like ongoing support for people. It's not just at the occurrence of violence. We talked about this last week too. And unfortunately, what Donna was talking about in terms of like this projection of like, well, I couldn't leave my situation, so you shouldn't leave yours, is a thing, unfortunately. Like this sort of envy that happens towards people who are considering leaving their situation now. And then a projection of that. Like if I had to deal with my violence through my entire life, who the hell are you to even consider, leaving? That unfortunately does happen. But let's open it up. So yeah, a DV 101 or a domestic violence literacy or something to that effect in the community that we're talking about. If anybody wants to take the floor.
Very quickly, I'll just share. We have Rhode Island Community Hire here that me and a few other or local social workers and LMHCs have organized, Alhamdulillah, for the last 3 years. And when we did suicide prevention talk last couple of years with local masjid here, Masjid Kareem, and a couple of others, imams from local masajids were also encouraged to come in, brothers and families. We did talk about double murder, suicide, DV issues, and we encouraged people to recognize that how many risk factors can be prevented if everywhere between early on couples counseling and family interventions, as in Quran we also are in Surah Talaq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that maybe you can have family impartial members who can come and try to reconcile between the couples. The problem is that if everybody is very self-righteous at their end, when they are the perpetrators, they don't want to entertain Nausbillah, even Allah's words. And so an imam can say something a couple of times. Imam's understanding is that some matters are just personal, and we hope that couples can resolve them on their own. They don't easily talk about sexuality issues, and they don't easily talk about verbal abuse, but they say that, if you're not a good provider and if you're not a good father, then that's a big issue. But we all know that there is more to it than there's just that. And so our hope is, one of my colleagues started a mother's circle, and then we also have convert brothers and sisters groups separately. And this theme comes up that, in your daily lives, living in the US, also being from another country, or refugee families from Afghanistan and other countries, Syria, African countries, etc. How can we do our best in terms of, at least we have to work with what we have, right? So it's the imams, the families, the school systems, us as the providers in mental health, culturally sensitively, and also then again building up the victim, helping them become more stronger. So in my sense, I think the group work is important, but I do see that group work is also again um, women shy away from, even with other women. One-on-one counseling, maybe they are more open to, because again, the idea is that in this community or in another community, some sister will go out and talk about my personal sharing that I shared in the group. So there's not quite a lot of DV related processing group work that are, at least they see women like to have, even if they are outside of that whole unsafe situation. But they prefer, in my experience, individual counseling more. And then I share books that can help them in their own time to read up on how to process all of the trauma, along with ongoing therapy and perhaps psych med treatment as well. Jazakallah khair.
And thank you everyone to start the discussion. Obviously, we don't have time to complete and thoroughly have that conversation. So for anybody who wants to share resources or emails with each other, this is the time to do it in the chat. Of course, these conversations that we started aren't going to be completely processed because of our limited time. But yeah, we could do a whole webinar on the impact of gossip and how that prevents people from getting mental health wellness in their lives, right? And just the threat of gossip. So we'll take one last question. So Bibi, go ahead. Thank you for being so patient.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you, Brother Zain, for the wonderful sharing. I learned so much today. I just want to, I'm from Singapore, so I'm a school counselor, but I work very closely. I'm also a trained family therapy, so I work closely with families. So what I see in Singapore, just share with you, even though we are 13% Muslim here, and because you mentioned something about Indonesia, because I also work closely with the Indonesian community and the Malay community. This is the Malay speaking world in Southeast Asia. So what I see, there's a pattern. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, majority of these people who are involved with the domestic family violence, whatever, we can talk about from children all the way to women, all the way to elderly. I see that I mean I'm not making generalization here because I'm very aware of what you said, but many of them come from the lower income family because I mean I find that they are really a double whammy, triple whammy with their financial issue. They stay in the rental flats, rental homes, and they've got their own subculture. And again, intergenerational is so visible here. And but that doesn't mean that we don't have the people in the upper elite, the top 20-30%, or the middle group. It's like a bell curve. So if you look at the pattern, so my question is, how do I mean we have so many NGOs, voluntary welfare organization that support. One of them is Casa Rauda. Casa Rauda is actually a Muslim based organization, but they also work together with the non-Muslim here because to get funding, so we have an open concept system. But I find that you talk about culture of silence, so I just wonder, this culture of silence and stigma have got to do with the help-seeking attitude and the behavior of our Muslim community. Somehow when they have issue, they shun away. So again, it's related to our sister Saira. So I just wonder, how do we actually empower the Muslim women, and what kind of? I mean, we can have circle, we can have healing circle, we can have mother circle, we can have women circle. But actually, in Singapore, also the high cost of living, people work three jobs. Sometimes women work three jobs too. So it's not that they do not want to be helped, or sometimes they're just caught in daily bread and butter issue, similar to the refugees and all that, and they don't get support. So I actually I don't know what to do. Seriously, I need help from all of you here. Wallahu alam. Thank you. Jazakumullah khairan.
Wayakum. I think that I want to encourage everyone to share emails. We'll leave the chat. We'll leave the if it's okay, Mr. Wafa, if it just like keep it open for like 5 minutes if anybody wants to leave their emails, and I will also send some resources to the emails that are put in the chat here. Yeah, economic abuse is also part of this. I saw this saying somewhere, and it applies differently to different contexts, but like the idea is that, capitalism keeps you so stressed about your finances that you can't participate in your convictions, right? Like the day-to-day grind, the day-to-day struggles that people go through. One thing that I will also mention that, of course, when people are struggling economically, the violence can in some ways become sorry, just one last real quick. So like can become more visible. But sometimes in economically privileged communities, it's less visible because of the gatekeeping that happens. So there is a difference in terms of how violence shows up in different economic class systems. However, there's also a greater visibility sometimes when people are gatekeeping in economically rich environments. So anyways, I digress, and we do have to end. Go ahead, Ahmad. Oh, I don't know if you meant to do that. Okay, so that was accidental. Okay, so I want to just thank everyone for being here, and we do have limited time, but I want to thank everyone for being here. We'll leave the chat open, although we'll close the conversation here just for about 2 minutes, and inshallah we'll see you around at the next webinar. We just it's such an honor to be in community with all of you, and inshallah we'll see you next time at our next webinar, inshallah. So thank you so much. Have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.